It's Wednesday, March 2nd, 2016, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, Super Tuesday is in the books. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton come out as the big winners. There's been a lot to talk about as it relates to the campaign coverage in these last few days. We'll get you caught up. Weekends are going to look a little different on MSNBC. Now that the news network canceled Melissa Harris Perry's program, there was some drama there this week as well. And turning the printed newspaper into something that resembles a little bit more of a smartphone. Sounds kind of funky, but the Los Angeles Times did it, and we'll tell you how. But before we do, let's talk about some of the other headlines to come from Sunday night's Oscar telecast. We've been talking for a few weeks about the lack of diversity in this year's nominees and wondering how host Chris Rock would address it.
Why this Oscars? Why this Oscars? You know, it's the 88th Academy Awards. It's the 88th Academy Awards, which means this whole no black nominees thing has happened at least 71 other times. Okay? You gotta figure that it happened in the 50s, in the 60s. You know, in the 60s, one of those years, Sydney didn't put out a movie. I'm sure there were no black nominees some of those years, say 62 or 63, and black people did not protest. Why? Because we had real things to protest at the time, you know? We had real things to protest. You know, we're too busy being raped and lynched to care about who won Best Cinematographer. You know, when your grandmother's swinging from a tree, it's really hard to care about Best Documentary Foreign Short.
So that was just a snippet of the monologue. Let me start by asking each of you about your reactions.
Well, I thought his monologue was on point. I think that it was funny, but it also brought up a lot of the issues that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks in terms of the lack of diversity and what Hollywood needs to do. But it also put it in, at least from that little clip that we just showed, it put it in perspective that there are much more important things to be protesting about or to be concerned about, especially in this election year and what's been happening not only on this campus but around the country. And I think he sort of brought that out in a way that made the audience in Hollywood uncomfortable, made those who are watching uncomfortable, but also brought it into some perspective, or at least was able to articulate it in a way that everyone would understand.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that if you wanted to see him as being a full-throated critic of Hollywood, you could. If you wanted to see that monologue as well, maybe he let Hollywood off a little bit with some of his remarks. You could see that too. I mean, I thought the quote to me that really summed up everything was when he said, "Is Hollywood racist? You're damn right it's racist, but it ain't that racist that you've grown accustomed to. Hollywood is sorority rapist." Racist.
Yeah.
It's like, we like you, Rhonda, but you're not a Kappa. That I thought was a really straight-on frontal assault on Hollywood and really got to the point.
You were mentioning, Ernest, that there were some moments in there where you could it was visibly uncomfortable for people, that there were cutaways to different members of the Hollywood elite, and it was almost as if they didn't know if they were supposed to laugh, if they were supposed to clap, or just kind of sit there and not show reaction.
Yeah, they were just trying to figure out, how to react. And I found it interesting that they had the cameras on the various black actors and comedians who were in the audience. But what I kept wondering the whole time I was watching it was how many were actually there, and were the numbers down? And I've been looking around to see whether or not the numbers who actually of actors and comedians of color were there, and I think the numbers were down. So I think they made the point there. But I did see how some people were laughing, and some people were like, "Okay, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do there."
Which is a sign of purposely making people
Right.
uncomfortable.
There were, and again, I thought overall he did a good job, given a very precarious, tightrope he had to walk. There were some parts of it that you could say were offensive. I mean, for example, I thought when he did the joke about Jada Pinkett Smith and whether she was not invited, was like he wasn't invited into Rihanna's panties. We didn't really need to
we didn't need to hear that. That was a line
That was a little bit
crossed.
overboard.
And later when he did, it wasn't part of the monologue, but when he did the joke about the Asian kids representing
that was what I was hoping
the
to
firm.
go ahead and listen to. So it was a rather crude joke there. Let's go ahead and take a listen to it.
As always, the results of tonight's Academy Awards have been tabulated by the accounting firm of PricewaterhouseCoopers. They sent us their most dedicated, accurate, and hard-working representatives. I want you to please welcome Ming Zhu, Bao Ling, and David Moskowitz. Yeah. It's okay. Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot. If anybody's upset about that joke, just tweet about it on your phone that was also made by these kids, okay?
So the points there being Asians, the model minority, good at math, that stereotype, and then also looking at varying perspectives on child labor laws and how child labor is considered an acceptable practice in certain Asian countries.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of tried to play it off by saying, go ahead and tweet. We know that, we have crossed some lines here in terms of Asian stereotypes, in terms of child labor and that sort of thing. But even though what you're doing this and you acknowledge it, still doesn't make it right.
It doesn't make it any better, and it did blow up in their face in that way.
And the problem is that comedians, and Chris Rock, good comedians are going to offend people, but he offended while also not basically acknowledging the broader diversity questions. He didn't talk about Hispanics in Hollywood. He didn't talk about Asians in Hollywood. Instead, he trotted out these little kids, which was really offensive. There was another time when I thought he was offensive but made a really good point, which is what you'd expect from a comedian like him when he's talking about, in the in memoriam package where they usually, all the actors who have died in the past year, he said this time it's just going to be all the black people who were shot by cops on their way to the movies. That's offensive, but it's making a larger point.
And I remember when he actually made that comment, they cut away to show some of the crowd, and you had some people who were really sort of like, whoa, I don't know what I'm going to do in response to that one, because that's not funny to me, or I didn't find that enjoyable. I thought that was one of the ones where it sort of went flat for him now.
Well, there was one rather bright spot. The Best Picture winner?
We've got two stories here. A story about degenerate clergy, and a story about a bunch of lawyers turning child abuse into a cottage industry. Which story do you want us to write? Because we're writing one of them.
Spotlight taking home the Academy Award for Best Picture. This is as much a win for journalism as it is for the actors and the filmmakers involved. In fact, a shout out to Jody Cohn, a reporter who I know, who said we should all celebrate this by going out and buying a newspaper subscription.
I can agree with that, and I'll say, I think some of us, maybe all of us, have seen Spotlight. I saw it in the special screening they had for the J School, and it was inspiring. And it did make you think how important journalism can be. So it was great that the film won the award. On the other hand, is it going to make any difference in terms of sort of the historic lows that journalists are at in terms of credibility with the public? I don't know. And also, I kind of agree with some critics who say, really, this was going back, 12 years or whatever? And investigative journalism, especially at American newspapers, is nothing like that today. Those newsrooms have been decimated, and print and broadcast journalists don't do that kind of work very often now.
I mean, I would agree with you, Mike. I think that this is, to me, when I look at it, and you talk about 12, 13 years ago, I look at this as this is probably one of the last big newspaper journalism investigative pieces that you're going to see from, say, like a Boston Globe or someone like that. I mean, at this point, the way journalism is, you're going to see this work from now on from, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times or someone, or even a sort of a I would say a cooperative agreement.
Like a ProPublica.
Like a ProPublica working with someone. That's where we are right now when it comes to investigative journalism, because to be able to do something like this now.
Metro dailies aren't working at that scale
and
anymore.
they don't have that scale to work at.
But if there's one sort of positive, silver lining to all that, we now have tools we didn't have 12 years ago to tell these stories across media in ways that are a lot more compelling and engaging with audiences. So if we can just somehow find the resources to do it, we have the tools to do that kind of storytelling.
And the one thing I'll say here is that the fact that this movie won shows that journalism matters. And when journalism is done well, regardless of how it's distributed, and it gets out there and people are talking about it, and it forces the power structure to do something about an injustice, that matters. And so to me, I think that that's one of the ways in which this movie winning the Oscar helps.
Okay, well, there was one other Oscar preview package that totally stood out to me, and I want to talk to you about it. It started production a little bit more than a year ago. Editors at the Los Angeles Times wondered, what if they were to try to make their newspaper, a pile of dead trees ostensibly, operate a little bit more like a smartphone? This is what landed on people's doorsteps this weekend.
We came up with an idea that I think is really unique. It's an interactive printed newspaper page. This page features an illustration that when held up to the light will change when the light shines through it. So if you have a bright source of light, the sun, a light in your house, any place that you can put a light behind the page and hold it up, you'll see it transform before your eyes. I think it's something really cool. It's something unique that I don't think anyone's ever seen done before. Something I think you should definitely check out.
So being here in mid-Missouri, we didn't have access to be able to get our hands on a copy of this to check out ourselves. But the concept behind it, when you talk about the type of scale that large metro dailies are working at, it is kind of cool in terms of the innovative aspect.
Yeah, it is kind of cool. And I think using it on something like the Oscars, especially in Los Angeles, will definitely help the Los Angeles Times. How you use that, say, on a daily basis on a story that has much more meat to it, that is, so say it's highly political or highly institutional, then I think you're going to run into some problems. I'm not saying you can't do that, but I think you can try to integrate it into that.
That's a matter, though, of not falling victim to shiny things syndrome. It's a matter of knowing and understand how you can use tools once you have them for effective storytelling, not using them just because you can.
Right.
Yeah, and first of all, the technology was actually kind of low tech. When you first told me about this, I thought, they printed a hologram on their paper or something? All they really did is they printed one half of the image on page 1, the other half on page 2, but they lined them up so perfectly that when you held it out to the light, then it bled through and you got to see this special effect. That's cool. It's a one-off. I don't see them doing it again, but it did remind me of something actually that happened here locally not all that long ago. So the Columbia Tribune back on Valentine's Day printed this special sort of cover for the front section of it. It was called Armageddon. It was that the poster of guns and fruit together. And that was a really interesting experiment that the Tribune engaged in as well. And if you wanted to think about how you could use art to capture a different audience or to make the paper, more engaging for people, if you could sustain it, that'd be great. I don't know that in either the case of the Times or the Tribune that they are going to sustain it.
Okay, well, weekends are going to look a little different on MSNBC, or maybe they won't. I guess it really depends on who you ask. That's because the cable news network canceled Melissa Harris Perry's Saturday morning show after she walked off, upset about how many times she was preempted for political coverage these past few months. On the face of it, it kind of sounds like talent being upset she's not getting the face time that she wants, so she's taking her program and she's going home.
That's the way I read it. I mean, when you look at the story or what's happening in its entirety, MSNBC made a choice, and they're saying, look, we have a highly volatile political season going on here that none of us expected, and we want to cash in on it, as has CNN, as has Fox News. And in order to do that, that means we're going to have to be the place for politics, is what they're calling it, 24/7. And Melissa Harris Perry's show doesn't fit into that. Bartlett Diaz.
Jose Diaz.
Bartlett, thank you. His show didn't fit into it, so they preempted him in order to do this. They made the choice to do that as opposed to weaving those shows in. She didn't like it, and so she went public with it, and it got nasty. So, I mean, to me, I think that's basically what the story is.
I'm afraid there's a conflict of two really good ideas, and the one that was going to win out is the one that the corporate heads at MSNBC decided was likely to, in the long run, increase their ratings. I mean, I like generally the fact that MSNBC is trying to get away from this liberal alternative to Fox and is trying to do journalism a little more straight up. But on the other hand, I don't really watch MSNBC that much more because even though they're doing sort of straight journalism, it looks a whole lot like what you see on CNN, for example. What Earnest Perry did bring, and she was a very controversial figure in some ways, but she brought on people and perspectives to talk about politics and the larger culture in ways that you really don't get to see. And some of the other hosts, again, who I rarely watch, did the same thing. And so if you're going to say, well, MSNBC is sacrificing diversity of opinion for a more straight-up journalistic approach, I can get that. But I could also see why don't you try to find a way to cover politics straight up and still let more diverse voices into that coverage?
Well, you know, one of the problems that I've had with MSNBC since they started this sort of tracking to the left, I guess you can call it, is I don't think they really understand their audience, because the audience that they're going after is much more diverse and thinks much more broadly on various issues than, say, the audience that Fox has gone after. I mean, Fox has gone after a certain niche demographic, and they have cultivated it, and they have grown it, and it works for them. MSNBC has always been all over the place trying to figure out what they wanted to do, and they've never really stuck with it long enough to see whether or not it would work.
I do think it's kind of funny that when we talk a lot about transparency and journalism as a value, that MSNBC tried to negotiate with her a severance package where she would basically have to shut up and say nothing negative about MSNBC. She turned it down rather than take the money because she wanted to be able to criticize the network.
Okay, well, so Super Tuesday. Yesterday, voters in 13 states went to the polls and put a bit of perspective into the tack that the rest of this campaign may end up taking. And it was a big day for Donald Trump, for Hillary Clinton. Also a big day in some ways for Marco Rubio, picking up the first state that he has won in this primary season, picking up Minnesota. Marco Rubio got a lot more media attention in this last week, 10 days or so, kind of by playing Trump's game against Trump.
Yeah, I think it says something actually bad about the influence that cable television coverage has had on that Republican primary, because Rubio got very little time, or for that matter, Cruz or anybody else, compared to Donald Trump on the airwaves until he decided to mimic Trump. And the moment he did that, all of a sudden, the cable networks were covering his rallies live, and he was getting a lot more traction. So in some ways, I think the way the cable networks have covered Trump says something bad about, TV celebrity and name calling and trash talking being more important than substantive issue discussion.
No, I mean, I agree with you. It's almost like, they're sitting there waiting to see which candidate is going to out-Trump Trump, and then how Trump is going to counter that. So it's almost like, it's almost like horse race politics, or horse race election coverage on steroids right now. I mean, I can't even watch it anymore. I mean, I watched about 5 minutes of it. I'm like, okay, I'm turning to BBC, because I just can't deal with this because every place you go, it's the same sort of name calling, the same sort of, high intensity rhetoric that I think is turning off a lot of voters, and maybe it's bringing some people on to watch just to see who's going to say the most egregious thing next.
I would say, though, it's not just cable television news that's guilty. I mean, Nate Silver over at 538 said that the New York Times had Rubio above the fold 3 times in the entire month of January, twice talking about his boots, a criticism of Donald Trump, and once about his debate performance in New Hampshire.
Mike, I agree with you. I think that what's happening that started out on cable has pulled many of what we'd call the traditional mainstream media in that same direction, and
water's sinking its own level, and the level is dropping.
The level is, and I don't know how you turn that around. I mean, I'm afraid of what might happen. I mean, now they're talking about you could have a contested nomination at the convention, at the Republican convention. They're talking about Trump himself is saying, once I wrap this up, I'm going to be attacking Hillary Clinton 24/7. I don't see where it's going to get any better if we keep going down this road.
So speaking of Trump, one of the things that he's there has been a lot of media drama surrounding his campaign in the last couple of days, going back to claim that he made that if he is elected president, he's going to change the libel laws, making it easier to sue the news media.
Which really,
both of you are doing the hands throw up thing.
The likelihood of that happening is very small. There's no federal libel law, first of all. Presidents don't have that power. And the courts in the New York Times Sullivan case many years ago basically said, if you're going after the media for libel, you have to prove actual malice, that we intended to lie about you in order to, to damage you. And that's a pretty hard, target to hit.
But then let's think about it. I mean, how many, since Donald Trump entered the race, he has given the president a whole bunch of powers, at least if he's president, a whole bunch of powers that aren't written in the Constitution or anywhere else. So when I read that, I was like, this is playing to the base. This is playing to people who see the media as the enemy, and it works on the stump, and that's where he's going with that.
I'll say one media angle to this whole thing about Trump that really fascinated me the past few days was regard to the New York Times and the editorial board meeting.
The record conversation.
So,
Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, so apparently back in January, Trump had a meeting with the editorial board of the New York Times. And also, I didn't know this until I read a little bit more about it, Dean Baquet, who is the executive editor, the top news person at the New York Times. And part of this conversation was off the record, and that he was talking about the possibility of an endorsement from the Times. But part of the conversation was on the record, talking about tariffs. Baquet got a hold of this and apparently they gave it to an editor on the paper to go over the part that was on the record, and somewhere after that it got leaked to BuzzFeed. And it raises a really interesting question. If Trump did say things that contradicted his public stance on immigration, does the New York Times have an obligation to report that? It's pretty hard if you've promised off the record, but it would be a lot cleaner decision if they hadn't made part of the conversation on the record and part of it off.
And here's the part that I don't understand. Why would you make any of that off the record? I mean, you're
Yeah.
talking to Donald Trump.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh. I shouldn't just laugh when you say that like that.
It shouldn't be off the record.
No.
I mean, the same thing with Cruz, the same thing with
Right,
Hillary
exactly.
Clinton. I mean,
it should be any presidential candidate. It just so happens it's Donald Trump.
If a candidate is meeting with the editorial board, it's all on the record. You don't make those kind of agreements. I mean, I just don't understand why you would do that.
So one more little nugget of Trump drama. At a rally over the weekend, scuffle between a Secret Service agent and a Time magazine photographer. That video available on our links blog and just about everywhere else on the internet. It was a pretty violent takedown.
Yeah, I saw that and I went, the guy has a camera. And I understand, the Secret Service, they're pretty protective.
Your point being that the camera's not a weapon.
I'm not
Not
saying
a deadly one.
Well, I just, when you look at it, and
Yeah.
I know that they had a previous confrontation between the Secret Service and this particular reporter.
Yeah.
But when you look at it, you kind of go like, okay, that was a little bit much. And I'm very interested to see what happens in terms of how the Secret Service investigates this and what happens afterwards.
I mean, my reaction was pretty visceral, too. I mean, that was quite a violent takedown of a journalist. But there is a lot of context. It isn't a really simple story. I mean, first of all, here are the journalists in their pen,
yes.
right? This very restricted area that they're not supposed to move from at a public campaign event. Right. The photographer wanted to go out and get pictures of these Black Lives Matters protesters, and the Secret Service tried to keep him back. He also, hey, this sounds a lot like Melissa Click, used the F-bomb on the Secret Service agent, and that precipitated the takedown. Does that justify the takedown? No, it does not. But the story is a lot more complicated than, hey, guy tackles a photographer and pins him to the floor.
But here's one of the problems that I have, and this goes back to 2012 and other elections, where all of a sudden the media is confined. Mm-hmm. And you're trying to find out, okay, why are they confining the media? Or why are they confining the photographers to certain areas? Especially at public rallies. I mean, why do they not have access to go wherever they feel the need?
And we know why. They want to manage the message as far as they can.
Exactly. And to me, that's the problem. But you have government agents who are in the basically who are in the act of managing political campaigns for candidates, who are running for office. They're not in office; they're running for office. So I mean, I have a serious problem with that. It's almost like we're basically saying to journalists and to the media that the government is going to manage your movement in covering political campaigns. I have a problem with that.
I'll say there's at least one other issue we're going to have to deal with as journalists for a long time, whether Trump wins the nomination or not. And that's, how did we get the Trump phenomenon so wrong? I mean, we predicted he wasn't going to be a serious candidate, that he was going to be out early.
And that's 6 months
something
ago.
Stupid he was going to say was going to disqualify him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, why is that? I mean, maybe it's because Trump is a little more savvy than we'd like to give him credit for. Last night, when he held that news conference instead of a rally after he'd won all those states, that was very careful manipulation of the media to make him look, more like a bridge builder and more like a compromiser and all that. But also
interesting during that was the look on Chris Christie's face behind him almost through the entire thing, too.
Yeah, but I also think it has a little something to do with journalists who are fairly well-to-do not really understanding the anger and the angst and the pain that a lot of people are feeling, and not just undereducated people, but a lot of people.
Ernest, touch upon that for a second. You were mentioning before we started today's program that you spent yesterday reading a lot of rhetoric from 1936.
Yeah, I'm doing some research right now on the African American press during the 1930s and 1940s, and you're looking back at I'm looking back at various campaigns and what's happening during that time period, and a lot of the rhetoric that I'm reading in these newspapers during that time period, I see a lot of that in our political discourse today, and you have to remember that it was, we're talking about the Great Depression. Right. So, and now we're talking about the Great Recession. So a lot of those same sort of dynamics are working their way. We're working our way through, at least in our political discourse now. They were trying to do a lot of the same things. I mean, it is a different time period. We don't have segregation or those kinds of things, but the kind of divisiveness that we're seeing today, I see a lot of that in doing that research.
And I think that historical context says a little bit about why we need to focus so much attention on whether or not Trump really meant it when he did or did not disavow the KKK, did or did not disavow David Duke. Yes, I get that he disavowed him before and after that interview with Jake Tapper, but during that interview, I mean, how do you forget who David Duke was? It's not my earpiece wasn't working.
Yeah, you can't blame an earpiece on the KKK. You hear those three letters, there's
not a lot of room for error there?
There's not a lot of room for error.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about today and a couple we didn't have time to get to. Check out the links blog for that. It's under the programs tab at KBIA.org. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @viewsonKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, to leave us comments, questions, see some previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. I'd like to thank RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show. Maya Jackson is our technical director. KBI's Kyle Felling handled the audio for us, and C. Chen is our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.